This world is slowly suffocating. It is bleeding, sweating, gasping for air.
We put our hands over our eyes and over our ears in order to stay sane, to not face where we're heading.
Rising waters and spreading fires taking life away from us. Citizens forced to run from their own land. Nature a commodity, growing into an unbalanced escalation.
Nations at war with one another.
Animals caged, never to experience what living means. Money made from extinction.
The power of a few, the fate of a mass.
We have become used to how it all is, and yet we question our world. We question our system, of course we do. And when we go to bed, we lie awake in the dark.
Our chest rising and falling, the window open.
The tree outside our window standing still, inhaling our exhalation. Our eyes open in the dark, our inhalation, the tree's exhalation. We can't fall asleep, there are no lullabies to sing.
Somewhere in our mind a sanctuary, only in our mind for now. A place of hope where we reach beyond, where we live like we never have before, where we collectively step back.
Where we're no longer the dominator, the disruptor. Where we truly coexist with what is around us.
Where nature can tell its story.
Where other forms of living have space and permission to be. Where this world can rest and heal and find freedom.
Where we rethink to redefine what living should be like. Hold on to this place in your mind.
If you let go of us as a living species. Our world can live without us.
It will bring us to our knees. If we want to stay, we cannot let go of the imagined.
The sanctuary in our mind. So many of us awake at night.
Our chests rising and falling.
Inhaling nature's exhalation. A silent exchange of life, already in rhythm with what is around us. The living, the moving, the alive.
Also from my side, welcome to the launch of the design and research group Becoming Regenerative. Bello, Atako and myself are super happy for having been given the chance by Dr. Toivonen to speak at this event today and to premiere our film today. Before we're going to discuss a little bit about the concept and the ideas we had for the film, I will briefly introduce the three of us. Asako is a graduate in fine art from Chelsea College of Art and Design, and she's currently working as a filmmaker here in London. Bella is a fine art graduate from Central St. Martin's, and she's currently pursuing a master's in philosophy and art theory. And I'm a master's student at Central St. Martin's in innovation management and also part of this design and research group. So with the film that you have just seen, we wanted to explore the topic of regeneration from a more creative and artistic perspective. And the film is based on my poem, A Sanctuary in Our Mind. And in that poem, I reflect on how our world is currently seemingly collapsing and that there is a real emergency to act now. So our economic system encourages us in thinking that nature is separate to us and that it is a free resource that we can forever exploit. But this means that not only nations are at war with one another on our planet currently, but that we as a collective are also in war with nature. But yeah, my idea with the poem was not to leave the reader with a very pessimistic or negative feeling, because I guess there are already a lot of bad news out there. Instead, I really wanted the poem to be centered around this idea that although we face these huge ecological, social, and structures issue, we still find the courage to envision and to imagine a world that we actually want to live in. So yeah, in many minds, this place where nature and humanity already coexist and where this world flourishes exists. And I believe that this visionary thinking and that the imagined play a huge role at the moment, because only if we can think where we want to live, or only if we can think of a world where the balance is restored, we can actually bring the sanctuary that already exists in our mind to life. So yeah, together the three of us turned the poem into a film, and if you scan the QR code, you can read the whole poem and also rewatch the film later if you'd like to. And now Bella and Asako will talk a little bit more about the concept, the ideas, and the film in general.
Hi, Asako, and thank you so much for coming here, and I'm really happy to share this film with you guys. So about the film, I wanted to explore different types of perception and also reconstruct the idea of nature. In the editing process, I was mainly focused on creating narrative through abstract images. My intention of this was to step away from looking at the nature from human-centric point of view, but to reconsider the various types of perceptions that living species have. So, like the juxtaposition footages such as close-up of horse eyes or bioorganism in this film, the nature is seen through a non-human point of view, and allowing us to reveal the intricate relationship between the human and the non-human beings. Likewise, it guides us to see the world in a non-linear or multidimensional way.
Hi everyone, I'm Bella. It's been an absolute pleasure to be a part of this project with Lena and Asako. So while discussing the filming process, we all recognize the importance of centralizing both collaboration and the natural world. And we believe that the film could not speak truthfully of a regenerative future without full consideration of the world as it is now. We were particularly drawn to the bright orange-red that you've seen that came to have a large role in the film. And with semiotics at play is perhaps an unsurprising yet relevant reference to both the climate emergency as well as the drive that we share towards something different and something better. The simple action of allowing nature to interfere with man-made fabrics provided us with dynamic visuals, which was in some sense ethereal, yet also the intense red still burns onwards. And the experience of filming this in London is perhaps even more interesting. Constant changes in weather, the overpopulation and pollution of our parks, and there was almost no slice of sky that wasn't invaded by high-rise buildings. Yet this is a piece of work that aims to invoke hope and encourage a different kind of thinking. I personally feel that both the pace of the film and the sound work reaffirm that there is still space within all of us to imagine a future that can be regenerative, encouraging us individually and communally to interact with the planet in a way that is gentle and full of purpose. If we keep these sanctuaries at the forefront of our minds while we go about our individual days and each actively take steps towards being the change that we wish to see, perhaps we can keep alive the dream for a brighter future, even though it feels like we're losing hope. Thank you all again once for your time, and you can scan the QR code on the screen now to access a link to this film and poem. And I would now like to hand over to Dr. Toivonen.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Becoming Regenerative. And thank you so much, Bella, Lena, and Asako, for that wonderful film that gave us a lot to think about. And it was specifically made for today's event. So I'm very happy for all the work, the creative work you've done. So this is the first ever public-facing event of the Becoming Regenerative Research Group at Central St. Martin's. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here. So this group was really set up in the first place to explore how regenerative ideas grow into tangible regenerative products and services and transformations. So that's the simple mission of the group, and we aim to keep going for about 7 to 8 years. The group is a synergistic space of multiple different inquiries, typically student-run, and sometimes staff get to contribute a little bit of their research as well. Today, I will start by explaining our vision in brief, and then I will set out 3 propositions which will hopefully help frame our panel. We have 4 remarkable panelists joining us today, and I think that will be one of the most fruitful parts of the whole afternoon. So that will happen, but at this point, let me also thank Samsung King's Cross, this innovation hub, for generously hosting us here today. Let me thank Central St. Martin's for funding our pilot study on which we built today, and let me thank the whole group, Becoming Regenerative group at Central St. Martin's. Your work has made this event possible, and I would love to thank all of my colleagues and also my line managers, Richie and Rebecca, for being so supportive of this work. And finally, let me thank Lillian Weierman for the beautiful slides that you'll be seeing today. So yes, let me go into the vision, the propositions, and then the panel will start. And after all that, we will have time for networking. And we obviously want you to engage with this work going forward. We want to keep going for many years. We want you to talk to us and sign up for the mailing list if possible. So there's a lot that we can do together. Let me get rid of this piece of paper. So yeah, 1 year ago, when we were kind of germinating as a research group at Central St. Martin's, we kind of started looking at designer entrepreneurs and companies that were learning how to create with and for nature. And we, at the outset, we kind of discovered 3 things. First thing is that mushrooms are in. Mushrooms are really central to this field, and if there was one symbol, I think it would have to be a mushroom for this field. The second thing was that it wasn't all that difficult to find interesting examples, interesting designs, interesting innovations, interesting companies all around us. Obviously, being at Central St. Martin's, it was particularly easy perhaps, but also in London, these examples now abound. But the third thing we realized was that even though it might feel like these, let's say, regenerative startups and designs and designers are proliferating, and there's a new one every day, it's not at all the case that the innovations that they produce are created overnight. No, it takes a long time, often many years of hard work and R&D to actually get to where they want to go and to bring about regenerative transformations. So that's what became our focus, kind of the journey of regenerative innovations. Now, if we take one example, let's fast forward a little bit here. Cool. If you take the case of Jen Keane, so she's one of the designers we have met during the past year during our pilot study. She used to be a designer at Adidas and then came to Central St. Martin's around 2014 or so, and she asked this very interesting question because she was exploring how to make fashion more sustainable, how to use different materials and all that. So she asked this very interesting question of, instead of sourcing our materials externally and cutting and stitching them into the shape we want, why don't we grow them directly into the garment we want, or into the shoe we want, perhaps. So as a result of that question, she came up with this idea of microbial weaving, working together with microbes to grow nanocellulose. And that's one of the examples emanating from her work and the work of her company, which is called Modern Synthesis. So that was kind of the beginning of her idea journey, or her creative journey. And of course, there are many, many episodes and parts of that journey where she built a team, a very cross-functional team with expertise in science and biology and business and so on. And they developed their pitch so that they learned to persuade more mainstream investors as well. And now they're at a point where they can really grow and scale their technology. So it hasn't been an overnight success to get to this point. The kind of microbial weaving process and technology that they have. It's taken at least 6 to 7 years. And I think it's fair to say that for companies, many other companies like Bolt Threads in the US and Biome here in the UK, as I'm sure Samantha will tell us about. They've also taken a very long time to develop their products. And it's really that period of time, in a way, from the idea to the kind of realization of the potential of that company that we want to look at. And that is the space for becoming regenerative. So that's what we want to explore. And because we feel that there's often so much focus paid on the products and the designs, the visuals, and all of that is obviously important and inspiring. But we want to bring a lot more focus on the process itself. We believe that for today's organizations, one of the key questions they need to ask is not just what is regeneration, what are the principles of regeneration. It is rather how to become regenerative as fast as possible. And that's why I want to really try to start a discussion today with the panel as well on that question, where we're more conscious about process and more conscious about the real world journey, the hardship, the challenges of really getting there, rather than just focusing on the products. So it would be, I think, fine to say that a lot of these startups and companies, designers that are mentioned, they are all informed by these regenerative principles that I talked about, but it's really the journey that gets us there. And it's really this process of emergence and becoming that's very important. So I think that's the main part of our vision there. There's a couple of side notes, definitional side notes. This may be more interesting to the academics among you. And then afterwards, I'll just set out the 3 propositions that I mentioned. So I also have a background in entrepreneurship studies, and it's often said that one thing entrepreneurs need to get good at is with sort of finding value where other people cannot detect that value yet. They have to see patterns that others don't see, and they have to find potential for profit as well in many cases, or social value. So in a somewhat analogous way, you could say that when you're in this field of regeneration, your job is to actualize regenerative potentials, going well beyond the paradigm of the sort of conventional paradigm of sustainability. So you may be working with living beings, with ecosystems. You're trying to imagine what could be there when you work from this regenerative perspective. Here is more of a research definition that we use in this recent working paper. And this tries to very briefly explain what regenerative creativity is about. You can go to that paper if you're interested in reading more. But what's more helpful than this, I think, is the mapping done here, where we try to open up this space a bit more. It's an emerging space. It's sometimes a little bit difficult to get across, to really put into words. But in brief, we are mostly interested in designers and in projects and in startups that are kind of at the intersection of those 3. So we're looking for cases in this research. We're looking to engage with cases where there's evidence of creating with nature. Could be with microbes or mycelium or other living beings and ecosystems. And we also want to find evidence of creating for nature, that there's a sense of actualizing potentials that will enhance living systems. And finally, we are looking for people and cases and projects where whole systems thinking is being implemented. So this is, in my mind, this is in opposition to a very narrow product-centric view, because that's quite common in the startup world, for instance, that you have to be laser focused on one product instead of the system. But in the regenerative world, we need to focus on helping living systems flourish and to really focus on their interconnections. So moving on, here's a little snapshot of the research vision and in some ways the process. So we want to gather data, focusing on co-creation, and that's kind of the more traditional academic part, empirical part there. Then we want to kind of tease out challenges. We believe that there are many shared challenges across different industries. So we're not just focused on fashion or architecture. We're interested in every sector where there are regenerative initiatives, and we believe that they will share certain challenges in common. We also want to curate community, as we are doing today. So we want to bring different audiences together to make sure that the questions and the ideas keep flowing regularly. And then hopefully through all this work, we will help organizations, also more mainstream organizations, to transition to this era of regeneration. So that's how we try to have impact, obviously working very collectively in most cases. And here's a little snapshot of that community that we are trying to curate. So we're learning from the pioneers in many ways, working with researchers and graduates, media partners, and then really trying to also work with mainstream organizations and the innovation managers within those organizations to help shift their mindsets and practices. So on to the propositions. Proposition 1, and these emanate from the research we've done over the past year, and they will inform the research going forward, but I hope they will also provide us with some food for thought today. So we have found that when designers and entrepreneurs work in this field, they actualize these regenerative potentials by working with various knowers of nature. So this includes, yes, scientists, experts, but also indigenous thinkers. So people who are familiar with particular living systems and organisms and let's say chemistry, principles of chemistry and all that. But the good news is that if you are looking to go into this field, you don't need to be a biologist or a chemist yourself. You can work with diverse teams, and that's exactly what the leading companies are doing. They're building very interesting mixed teams with a balanced sort of balance of expertise in business and design and science. That's, for me, that's one of the most interesting parts about this field. And arguably, you kind of need that assortment of people to be able to perceive regenerative opportunities out there in the world. And so the second proposition is that designers really excel at exploiting familiar forms, as we've just seen, sneakers, for instance, while pursuing regenerative revolutions. So this is very intriguing for me at an intellectual level as well. You keep something the same, so you're basically making sure that there's a sense of familiarity, but there's also novelty and there's transformation. Some of you may have read about optimal distinctiveness in management and organization theory, which is the idea that in order to be successful, new ideas and new companies need to be a little bit new, but they also need to be quite familiar. So they have to kind of hit that sweet spot, because if they're too new, people will reject them. People will not find that they're legitimate or credible. So they have to kind of hit that sweet spot, and we wonder how this functions in the world of regenerative design and innovation. So we plan to explore further. The third proposition, and this one is the most compelling one for me personally, is that we learn to become regenerative not only through high-level principles and the textbooks or even events like this, but through creating, through relating. So this is really empathy in active form, where you're working with living organisms that are very different from human beings, but they still think, they still they move, they respond to the environment. They have many attributes that you can comprehend, and you have to exercise your empathy, your imagination to kind of build bridges with that organism. And we often heard during our interviews, our first series of interviews, that you know, a designer would say that I started to think about what the organism wants, you know, how it behaves and how I should you know, work with it. And it became a collaborative exercise. So this is really about moving from a kind of old-style innovation and design to something that is very non-exploitative and that is kind of very decolonialized, because you are, you know, you're working as equals, as collaborators there. And I think this is a theme that we will probably come back to in the panel. And speaking of which, we're almost there. I wanted to just say that for these reasons, we believe that if you and if organizations around the world engage in regenerative creativity, that will really transform the way that they approach innovation. And we don't fully understand yet how all these related mechanisms work. We don't have sort of perfect answers for how to promote regenerative innovation, but we have some ingredients that we'd love to start with here. And yeah, we'd love for you to engage with this project. It's kind of early days still. Things are very open and we were very welcoming. So please speak to us after the event, sign up for the mailing list. We've got a QR code on the final slide. So please make a note of that. At this point, let me conclude my own talk and welcome our spectacular panel. So Samantha, Delfina, Sam, and Ennikukka, please give them a big round of applause.
I think I'm going in the middle.
Right. All right, well, first of all, thanks so much for coming today. It's really a real pleasure to have you here. And it's going to be a very relaxed discussion about kind of whatever we want to talk about. It's more or less up to us. We can touch upon some of the themes that I outlined today if we want to, and I've got a list of questions, but feel free to take the discussion into any direction that you want to explore. So I thought I'd kick off with kind of a personal question about your background in broadly this field of regenerative design, innovation. So if you could tell us your name and broadly what sort of brought you to this field. And then the more personal question is, have you changed in any way, or has your thinking changed after you've come to the field or through your work in this field? So maybe we can just go in this order.
Yeah, sure. I'm Samantha, can see. And I guess my background is in biochemistry, so that can be quite a compartmentalized field. We like our boxes in the hard sciences. And about 3 years ago, I started working at Biome, and that was for me a step into both industry and into applying biotechnology in not just the sciences, but in design and in industry. And that move into these really interdisciplinary teams kind of brought me into the world of regenerative design and looking at things through different lenses and approaching these questions and these problems through all of these different angles. So I think that's definitely opened my mind to all the different ways that you can tackle these issues and not just through a scientific perspective, which has been very nice, and I think has definitely made me grow in a more creative way. Events like these in particular and having these kind of discussions have definitely made me into a more creative person, I think I would say.
Brilliant. Well, I hope today will be part of that journey as well. Thank you. And so Delfina, how about yourself?
Thank you. Well, I am Delfina. I have a background in biology, and I did a PhD in design, so somehow regenerative design is the field I've been waiting for. Because sustainability never really made sense to me, so the way that I embraced the concept is embedding this in the curricula. I was leading a unit in regenerative design a couple of years ago, and now in my practice and in my PhD supervisions is something that I constantly try to embed. And in that same ground, for me, it's really interesting to combine and integrate ecological principles and ecological values with very creative ideas. And this kind of relation, it's particularly interesting to me. And I guess in the other way that I embrace the topic is something I really want to make publicly available. Recently, myself and Samuel were design researchers in residency at the Design Museum. The residency finished with an exhibition called Restore. So for that instance, I was working with a company called Saltico. And going back to the groups, they were a group formed by a person with a background in business, one chemist, one engineer, and one designer. And basically what they do is they're re-wetting the wetlands in Scotland. As you might know, wetlands are the most efficient carbon capturing natural resources that the planet have. And they were working what they called experimental farmers, which I loved. And basically what they do is they shift that farmer's economy into re-wetting these wetlands, and they produce this biopath without removing the roots. So they just collect it. This biopath is incredible, it's hydrophobic and it's super warm, and it's the perfect replacement from feathers or from synthetics. And now they have received a massive amount of funding from H&M, so they actually scaled it. So what I did in my exhibition is I was incorporating their biopath, but I put it into this big question about future inhabitants. In the future, how do we need to learn different, and which values are we embedding in whatever we're surrounded with?
Thanks so much. Thank you. Samuel.
Hi. I'm Samuel. I am the design engineer at Petit Plis, which is a company that makes it makes a patented auxetic material that can grow in both directions and is used for children's clothing, which can fit from a large range from 9 months to 4 years. It's used for a lot of other products as well. This is the aim of that is to reduce the amount of clothing that we buy, which we definitely should be reducing. And then also, as Delphina said, I was one of the design researchers in residence this year at the Design Museum, and I was looking at the UK's water quality, fresh water, which is awful, and something that we could potentially do about that. Looking at algae and how algal blooms, which is kind of one of the visual indicators of this bad water quality, could be perceived as a resource rather than a waste.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And at this point, I should remind the audience that we will have time for your questions in about 20, 30 minutes or so. So please start preparing those. I think there could be many follow-up questions that I could pose to you. But I guess one that comes to mind immediately is that is about the challenges, I suppose, along the way. I mean, you're all working on regenerative projects, companies. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges of really being successful in this field, or creating something that can have a transformative impact, or even developing a new material for, let's say, the construction industry? Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest obstacles or challenges along the way?
Well, I would say so I think I forgot to mention what it is exactly that I do. So I work with fungi at a company called Biome to make mycelium materials that we use in the construction industry. And working with bio-based materials is quite difficult in general, because the systems that we have in place for these scaled products do not suit bio-based materials, and not through any fault necessarily of the bio-based materials, but just because when you are treating something that is bio-based to the standards of something that is not, it's like testing apples and oranges. So trying to integrate a new material that has not previously existed into existing systems that are designed around something that is completely different is quite an obstacle. And there are lots of organizations and people working to try and change these systems to be more open and to be more biocentric, which is great. But I think that is one of the biggest hurdles that a lot of biomaterials are coming up against at the moment is the system.
Absolutely. That is really thought-provoking, because when we get really into this field for the first time, let's say, and really enthusiastic, we tend to think that it might be enough if we just come up with this new material, this new biomaterial, this new innovation, and that's enough, right? And things will change. But you are reminding us that it's the system will require wider changes in order for things to align. Great. Thank you. I'm going to jump over to Enni Kukka, who has joined us on the screen. Welcome, Enni Kukka. Can you hear us?
Thank you very much, Stalker. It's lovely to be here, even if remotely, and great to meet all the rest of the panel as well and hear your introductions.
Great. So I'm going to ask you to say a few things about yourself and your work in this field, and if you could also please comment on any challenges that you've faced when working on regenerative designs or innovations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tukka. My name is Enni Kukka Tuomala, and I'm the world's first empathy artist and designer, which means that my whole practice is centered around transforming empathy from an individual feeling to a radical and collective power for systemic change. So I really related to what you said at the end of your talk, Tukka, talking about how we can actually creating through relating. This is really what I strive to do with my work and my practice. For years, my work was really focused on interpersonal empathy between humans. And over the last 2 years, I've really expanded and evolved both my approach and my processes, but also the outcomes of my work to really look at empathy between humans and non-humans. So really exploring empathy in an interspecies context, which, as we all here today know, is absolutely vital and is needed more than ever. So I'm currently developing new bodies of research and new bodies of work, specifically exploring the role of empathy in these human to non-human relationships and interactions. And as a part of that, one of my new tools and models that I've been working on is called the empathy ecosystem, that really starts to outline the role of empathy across history, but also across economies and across ecologies. So I'm really thrilled to be talking with you all today. I think this is absolutely vital. And in my own practice, I've really felt the need to shift focus, but also urge all of us to consider how we can not just look at regeneration as part of the sort of outcomes of our work, but also how to create more regenerative practices in the ways we work as well.
Thank you so much, Enni Kukka. Just a very quick follow-on question about challenges and difficulties. I know that you have had these projects relating to forests in Finland, for instance, and you're kind of challenging many stakeholders to think very differently about the relationship that Finnish people have with forests. What difficulties have you encountered there, or challenges?
Thank you. That's a great question. So you're referring to my ongoing project called Forest Empathy. And as a part of the project, I've really started outlining our relationship with the forest from the perspective of the forest. So really starting to challenge the way we use the forest in our human histories, especially in Finland, where both you and I are from. So much of our economy and our national identity is really defined through these relationships with the forest that historically have been really very much defined by sort of a human need and through a human perspective. And what I'm really asking through this project is, do we actually, as humans, as much as we need trees and forests to survive on this planet, do we actually understand the perspectives and the experiences of the trees in the forest, of the forest themselves, these incredibly diverse ecosystems that sustain so many species? Do we actually consider what the forest needs? What do the trees need? So at the moment, I'm working with the Forest Museum of Finland, Lusto, on this project, and it's been fascinating to get to work with researchers and tap into their incredible networks, both across industry and academia. So it's an ongoing project, but certainly brings up interesting perspectives. And again, to look at this really from a systemic perspective across industry, across a sort of a national economy, really, as it is in the case of Finland, and then look at individual needs on the basis of different forests around the country, but also different human and non-human needs that we're facing in the current situation.
Thanks very much. That's very interesting. I'm going to move to Delphina next. And you also talked about the intersection of creativity and regeneration, and that combination potentially being promising, but also perhaps difficult in the educational context. And if you'd like to focus on that angle, that would be great. But if there's anything else you want to comment on when it comes to the challenges of regeneration, I'd love to
Maybe
hear.
a brief challenge about regeneration, and it's something we briefly chat with Samantha before. We have a discussion about biology and where are we at now. And a big challenge is time. Biological processes take time. For example, if you want to make a multi-crop field, it takes time. It takes time to measure how the earth is benefiting, how that plant is producing better fruits. So time, I think it's an interesting variable to incorporate into the difficulties and challenges of truly being regenerative. The same thing happens, for example, when you are replenishing seabeds. It takes time to measure. And then in terms of creativity, design, I think the big challenge I face with the students, often they think it's kind of similar to sustainability, but what's that extra leap that you're actually providing health and you're not just doing less bad? By my own experience, I would say 40% of students that get all the discourse and are encouraged end up just not doing that extra interesting leap. And in terms of mixing disciplines, I think it's interesting because scientists often get paralyzed when creative people bring kind of very far-off ideas, and at the same time the complexity is when creative people take scientific ideas and they don't really understand. And this, I think, can go back either to taking science and ecological understanding, and can also go back to working with indigenous communities, not fully getting the cosmology and being fully embedded in what that really means.
Great, and the solution would be more diversity, more complementary teams, higher level of understanding.
Exactly. And then maybe going back to any Kuka, empathy, and also, you really need to get embedded with whatever field you're doing. You really have to be there and put all in. It's not just from a distant kind of academic, distanced literature that you're going to fully understand what's going on.
So that's very different from academia, but it's also different from kind of the prevalent startup mentality, where you drop one interesting app into the world and then you profit from that and everything's good, right?
Exactly.
You have to be much more interconnected. Samuel, would you have any other comments on these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was going to say as well, like the startup mentality, I don't really think fits particularly well with regenerative projects all the time. I think there can be ways of kind of fitting yourself in, getting around, and creating something that can be profitable, which is, for example, a bio-based material, or I don't know, other areas like if we talk about empathy, like a part of empathy is even with animals or other organisms, we need to kind of understand better the sensory ecology of these organisms. So like before we can empathize with something, we need to know what is its sensory perception. What can it see? Can it feel? What, all of these things can it hear? Before we could even say like, this is some way in which we can benefit the animal. And with that, I think like sensor technology is also potentially beneficial for like regenerative projects, and these kind of making sensor products really benefit from all of the things that hardware technology like Moore's law and the benefits of AI making sensors more powerful benefit from as well. So I think there's ways of kind of slightly subverting what technology has created and what we have like created really well at the moment. But I also think some of the big challenges are kind of, as Delphina said, like, you can't speed a lot of these things up. And at some point, there's just like, we have to actually like, you know, go in and do things that are slow and aren't going to create like a 10x profit. They're just going to take a long time. Yeah.
That is hugely interesting. And obviously there are many contradictions there because many would say that we need to transition very quickly, but you're saying it will necessarily take a long time to bring these innovations to fruition. But I actually want to take this question back to Samantha as well, because Samantha happens to work for a startup. So to some extent, you are using the biome is using that template in a way. And Samuel has just said that it doesn't really, it's hard to reconcile. So I guess the question is how do
it's
you
hard,
reconcile?
but I think like biome is an example where it does.
Yeah. It is very hard to reconcile. I think it's a strange place to work at that intersection between industry and the commercial side and the science and the regenerative side of the company, which wants to really push the regenerative agenda, I guess you could say, and really be true to everything that we've just spoken about. You know, the however long things take, it will take, because this is an organism that we're working with. It's you know, we always say that the mycelium is the another colleague. You know, you're working with another organism, and that's a mindset that is very important to maintain, particularly when you're working with something that is living. But I think the reason that it can work is when you look at these different aspects and really embrace the interdisciplinarity of something, which is like what you were talking about with the forests as well, and ecosystems. These things work and thrive and survive and are stable with diversity. So we need to, what the phrase is, bank on diversity like nature does. So if we want to sustain ourselves as a company, as a society, as an anything, diversity is one of the biggest strengths that you can have. So working interdisciplinarily, I think is one of the best things. A company, a startup, whoever it is that's working within a regenerative ideology, that's one of the most important things that you can do to be true to that. But
and maybe you're also pointing to something that I might call ambidexterity. There's a single company, but it does many things, and some have very sort of expanded time horizons, and others are more. Other projects are more short term, and you can produce value at different levels.
Yeah, precisely. Yes, we have some remediation projects, which is, I think, maybe what you were hinting at, which are super exciting. And it's working with waste streams that might be problematic, like plastics, for instance, and trying to work with the fungi to degrade them. And this doesn't necessarily have one product at the end of this project. And there's an infinite timeline available for these kind of projects, but it's very important that we address these issues and address these other capabilities that the organism, our colleague, can do. So it's,
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that round. I mean, this brings us quite naturally to the big question of scaling, and we sort of touched upon that already. And I know that this question might sound more relevant for startups, but I think it is perhaps relevant to Ennikukka as well, and to Delphina through education. But how do you think of the question of scaling when it comes to regenerative innovation and creativity? Is that a term we should be using? Is it possible to scale quickly in some cases? What are some of the limitations? We could also speak of impact and just having a larger impact. Maybe we could go directly to Delphina, because I have a feeling she has a lot to say about this.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and in a way that takes us to this idea of this current discussion of growth, degrowth, what's happening in that territory. Definitely we need to change our lifestyles, that's something clear. We need to think about business in a different manner. But saying that, that's not the end of production, it's just that we need to produce more consciously and in a much better way. And I think a key aspect of scaling is diversity, going back. we realized that mono anything is very damaging. So I believe in many different approaches at very different scales. And perhaps, a commercial example is Patagonia. Patagonia created the first line of t-shirts working with farmers in India. And it's not that they just got like one piece of land and work with that big company in India. They approached hundreds of different farmers to kind of make these monocrops fields multi-crop. So that's the nice part, but then about perhaps scales that take us to the global world. So I think also another element that we should be thinking in the future is about being bioregional, because obviously that doesn't stop Patagonia to moving things around and the result of like a huge use of fossil fuels. So I think these two things should be also in consideration.
Great. That definitely gets us thinking about this. Samuel, any thoughts on this evil notion of scaling?
I think so I've been working and kind of researching in the algae sector, algae community for a while. And I guess what we just talked about brought up one interesting kind of tidbit, which was a company that I won't name is now working with a very big company I won't name in making algae-based food additives. And one of the biggest things that they had to do was to kind of meet the stringent requirements of the larger companies' food manufacturing. They had to grow algae using glucose, or like a sugar-derived growth, rather than photosynthesis. And what was interesting is, in the scale, you've essentially lost one of the greatest attributes of what you were doing in the first place, which was carbon sequestering and like growing from light. So they're not using that method any longer. I know that I'm keep saying depressing things, but what I think it's just like an idea from that is the systems need to change in terms of how stringent do we have to be, and maybe we have to relinquish some of this stringency if we're going to accept more biologically grown materials and things. I'm sure Biome has also faced similar issues of I know the construction industry has tons of legislation and regulations. So yeah, that's one story that it made me think about in terms of scale. I guess what that also made me think about, potentially we could have companies that literally built in from the beginning, they're thinking about values other than profit that they don't want to change. What if from the beginning this company had thought, we understand that sequestering carbon is one of the greatest things about algae, and we really do not want to lose that, then maybe this switch wouldn't have happened. Yeah.
Those are definitely some of the toughest questions. I would agree, and I think we'll come back to this at the very end in a moment. This idea of how to kind of protect this integrity or the integrity of companies when it comes to regeneration. And I think what you're pointing to as well is this need for a high level of awareness and education among the public, and especially, of course, students going into this field where it's not about, we're making algae, we're making this from seaweed. It's not about that. It's about a more holistic understanding of what's actually going on and what are the ecosystem impacts there. Whereas oftentimes, I think there's a risk that anything that's labeled regenerative is treated at the surface level oftentimes, and it's we're using this fancy leather substitute, for instance. And then that's the end of story, right? So thank you for that. I wanted to turn to Samantha as well, and then to Ennikukka after. How do you think about these questions, dilemmas of scaling?
Yeah, scaling is a difficult one. I think we have a tendency to think of scaling as a kind of a linear process of taking one thing and making it bigger or making it more, when really it's a multi-dimensional topic. It's instead of taking one thing and making it bigger, you could think of it in a modular sense. So having, for example, small factories producing the same thing scattered all over the place rather than one massive centralized system. So decentralizing is also a form of scaling, just not in that linear fashion. So that's also a really interesting method, is decentralizing your production if you're producing a product, and then you can tailor that and those systems to whatever local community that you're in. So scaling can also become a part of a social enterprise as well. So looking at where you want to scale could definitely play a part in how you approach that.
Great. No, that sounds really powerful. This sort of to kind of you're asking us to rethink our notion of scaling as well, because very easily we slip into these industrial age paradigms or labels, and then they might limit our thinking. But yeah, I like that idea, and Biome is actually implementing this as well, right? Thinking in a more distributed, localized way.
Yeah. So one of the approaches we're taking is looking at local waste streams, usually organic, and designing a factory based around that, or designing and tweaking our materials based around what local waste streams are available. So that flexibility within the design process and within the mindset of your company, your organization, who you are, that's very important to being regenerative. That flexibility allows you to adapt to wherever it is that you are setting up.
That's a very interesting challenge to a lot of the larger corporations in the world, right? Who might not be used to that model in the same way. Yes. Let me now turn to Ennikukka, and you, I don't know if you want to address this question through the notion of scaling, or through critiquing scaling, or maybe through something like cultural change, which may be more relevant in your case. How do you bring that about, and what are the challenges there?
Thank you, Tuukka, and thank you to the panel. It's been wonderful hearing your answers. And really, I wanted to sort of build on what's been said before. It's almost I feel it's not a question of whether to scale or not, but really how the scaling takes place. What are the processes that are implemented, and why those are implemented as well. I would, once again, thinking about the theme of today, but also the themes of all of our work, return back to nature, because who is better at scaling than nature itself? So again, how can we learn from how our other species, our other collaborators? I love what you said earlier, Samantha, about how we really need to think about our non-human colleagues, and I often talk about our non-human collaborators. How do they scale things in nature? Those are really the best examples I think we should be looking to, and a lot of that has to do with decentralized systems, localized systems, and really these networks of organisms that actually work together to scale things. So I think there are a lot of beautiful examples there that we can absolutely continue to learn from. But building on that and extending, as you said, Tuukka, as well, thinking about it from a wider cultural perspective, I think at this point it's probably useful to quote the brilliant book Flourish that came out quite recently by Sarah Ichioka and Michael Paulin. And one of the things they talk a lot about is how we actually, instead of needing a technological shift or transformation to drive this necessary change, we actually need a cultural shift. We really need a wider transformation in our mindsets and in how we are able to comprehend and relate to these challenges. And that's really where I feel like my expertise comes in and where my work fits in. Ultimately, so much of what we're talking about now is really still an act of imagination. And this is something you talked a lot about in your address, Tuukka, as well, this sense of imagining what could be. And I really feel like that's where creativity And a lot of the things that we're able to offer are our superpowers, and our skill set comes in building different processes, creating spaces, building opportunities for us to start collectively imagining what could be. And this is ultimately, I feel, the most radical act of all, because we have to be able to imagine these alternative regenerative futures to then be able to realize them and act upon them. So this idea of how do we really shift our collective cultural mindsets is a huge challenge, but I feel such a huge opportunity. How do we stop focusing on a human-centered view of the world? And even in design and innovation, human-centeredness has been such a huge focus now for years, decades, which at the time was an important shift. But again, the time that we live in, that's no longer enough. We certainly need to move away from a human-centered perspective to a more planet-centered perspective. And going back to this question about scaling, maybe a useful way to tie this back up and refer to something both Delphina and Samantha talked about. When we think about scaling, all these processes currently are first and foremost sort of defined through the needs of global financial markets. And again, these systems that are very much man-made or human-created systems that then define the needs and the timelines and the outcomes of our processes. How do we again redefine these, not from a human-centered perspective, but from a planet-centered perspective, and really think about needs and wants beyond our own, which is what has got us to this position that we're in today in the first place. So I wholeheartedly agree with everything that the panel has said so far, but really encourage us to consider these radical acts of imagination that we desperately need to help us shift our mindsets.
Thanks very much, Ennikuka. That's thought-provoking, and it's a really healthy reminder to many of us here who are from the cultural and creative industries that we may have a role to play as well. Although, as you could see, if you look at the title of the event, we have biomaterials there, and which is something that I'm fascinated with, of course, and that's very relevant to this field. But I wanted to kind of ask whether there is this sort of dualistic tendency almost when we talk about biomaterials, where we almost like, if we're not careful, we will move back sort of away again from this cultural focus to kind of a more narrow kind of black boxing of these materials. And we say, we've developed this biomaterial, here you go. You don't need any transformation. You don't need any cultural shifts. Here's a better chair. Here's a better smartphone, perhaps, that's made in an ecological way. Our company has designed it. You don't have to think about culture or assumptions or behaviors. It's all made for you. And we kind of had a chat about this with Samuel a week ago, so I was sort of curious to try to sort of explore that a bit further, because Ennikuka's kind of reminded us of the importance of values, but then if you look at the markets, it's all about this talk around biomaterials and how big they will be and how great they will be and all that. So how do you come to this topic, Samuel?
Yeah, so I forgot who the technologist was, but there's someone who said that there's a vision of technology future in which screens disappear and become invisible, and our interaction with technology, we can't see it. And in a sense, that might be an amazing achievement, because it's like we're no longer having to look at bright screens, and we're like reconnecting with nature. But it might also be an even bigger kind of, or even further step into a black boxing of not understanding the technology that we're interacting with. I think I see some similarity in materials as well. So there are some companies that I've seen which are being successful through essentially replacing products and items that we already have with basically no discernible difference at all to us, apart from the kind of labels that this is sustainable and not. And although, don't get me wrong, I think it's great that like these things come into fruition, like plastics that can replace the plastics that we have already. It's great. I do, however, think that there's something almost sad about the idea that the only future that is regenerative or restorative that we can imagine is one in which nothing has changed and we're just given all the same things that we wanted anyway. I think, Delphina, your design museum project this year kind of started off the back of that as well. But I guess, yeah, my final point with sharing what Eni Kuka was saying is that we need the cultural shift as well. And the potential problem if we create these products and materials that are regenerative or sustainable and exactly the same is that we don't make any cultural shift at all. So maybe part of being the designer is not just to recreate the products that we've seen so far, it's to create products that change us culturally as well. But yeah, also I think Delphina should talk about it.
Samuel, I fully agree that we need to envision alternative lifestyles, and it's not just repeating this, but with bioproducts. And I also, for me, biodesign is not synonym to regenerative design. To me, the regenerative aspect means you need to have a salutogenic, meaning providing health back. So if you think producing a new chair with algae or doesn't matter and keep this neoliberal way of disposing and getting new things, or same thing with fashion, to me that's not salutogenic, and it could be very bio, but it's not salutogenic, so I don't believe it's a synonym.
That's very sobering, very useful to us because, if we're not watchful, then it's quite easy to fall into this kind of product box in a way. Here's a flashy new thing that's a little bit more sustainable, and let's put this regenerative label on it, and it will look good. So this is all very useful. Samantha, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that as well. It's one of the biggest problems we have is just the amount of waste that we've got, and at the moment that's problematic waste, but food waste. That's not plastic, but that is one of the biggest waste problems that we've got, and it's an organic waste stream that we can eat. We don't even need to feed that to crazily engineered organisms to get rid of it, and that's one of our biggest waste streams. So if we don't address the cultural issue, like you were saying, then we're just going to continue with this mounting pile of waste. One example is I always think of this one, the lids that you get that say biodegradable on them, those plastic cups that are biodegradable plastic. They are biodegradable, but in an industrial fermenter. If you just throw it in the bin, which everybody does, it's not going to degrade. It's probably going to take the same amount of time in landfill as normal plastic will. And that's not on the label, which is a shame. But by just swapping things out and making people think it's biodegradable, we are not educating people, and we are just glossing over what is the problem that is still there. But
yeah. Yeah, I think hopefully there's a shift that's coming that we're going to define things as home compostable and use those types of materials more. I think that would be really important to have more and less of the only industrially biodegradable.
You reminded me of a conversation I'd had a little while ago with a friend about vegan bacon.
Bacon.
Bacon, yes, yeah. Bacon. And they were saying, what is the point of this stuff? Because there is so many cuisines in the world that don't rely on meat to be the central topic of it. Why would you bother making fake meat when you could have tempeh or all of the other possibilities that are out there in the world, or a meal that doesn't require meat in the first place? Why are you trying to sub something in to swap these things out when there are so many other options out there? Which is, I think, a really interesting point that we can apply to this conversation as well. But also the fact that these products, like bacon, can be quite useful as a segue into a more vegetarian lifestyle or into a more regenerative mindset and culture. So do you think that it's a good transitionary mindset?
And I think that's the difference. the faking is helping someone transition and change culturally, it's helping them lead a vegan, vegetarian lifestyle, and maybe will help them introduce to other products, which like tempeh, tofu. The issue is when something is just like a total replacement with no changes required, that I don't think it provides any transition at all.
Like the coffee lids, yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to add a little bit to that discussion about transitioning from meat to soya and all the derivatives. I think, again, thinking in biodiversity and thinking about the necessary variety, soya can be very detrimental for the soil, can erode it, and because it's such a good business and because vegetarians have grown exponentially lately, people fall into tofu mainly, which is also really bad, considering then all the farmers abandoned whatever they were planting, and they're all now planting soya. So diversity and multi-crops, I think, is something that we always need to have in mind when we think about transitions.
So it's really the broader principles of regeneration, salutogenic innovation, I guess, that we must bear in mind in all of these spheres. Our audience has been really patient and nice with us. So I think now is finally the time to start taking questions. I wonder if Molly will help us out with the microphones, and yeah, it's all up to you to come up with further questions to take the discussion beyond the present topics. And please introduce yourself briefly, if you could.
Yeah, no problem. My name is Barama Asari. I'm a second-year product design student. And it was really interesting the way you were talking about regenerative design, because as a designer, we really focus on, okay, we should be sustainable, but how do we do it? We're going to replace plastic with wood. And wood's good because it doesn't damage the environment. Good, that's where the conversation ends. I think really the way to change it is going down to the way we live. Because right now, we're shifting from petrol cars to electric cars, but they're still cars. It's not really changing the whole flow, it's just switching it out. But I think it comes down to people willing to sacrifice. Like, are you willing to go to the store and not have any bag and just hold it? Because, well, we have the biodegradable bags, but you need a certain process to degrade it. If we just reduce what we're using, we could really solve a lot more problems than just swapping things out and then living the same lifestyle and then generate new problems.
Thank you so much. That's a great comment.
Can I jump on this
I
one,
agree.
Luca?
You can, definitely, yes.
Thank you. I think that's such a fantastic point, and I just wanted to respond to it because that's what I was trying to say earlier with this idea of how we, especially as designers and innovators and creatives, this is such a huge opportunity for us to actually imagine those alternative ways of doing things, ways of living. It always makes me think of that absolutely classic Henry Ford quote that's been used to death, but I think it really applies here. You know, he always said that if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse. And I think this is, again, that example of, and there's been some brilliant examples from the panel around how there are lots of products out there that are sort of encouraging us to switch, and in some cases maybe that can be useful, but it's just not enough. We're living in a time where it's just not enough. And again, I would like to put it out to everyone here today, and I know there are a lot of students in the audience as well. This is the really exciting bit. This is where we can have such a disproportionate effect of not just imagining a faster horse, but what would be that genuinely radical, transformative solution for the future that is possibly scalable in a way that's very thought through, but really looking at it from a systemic perspective. You know, I think what Delphina, what you've been saying around some of the sort of wider impact and implications of switching, for example, to soy, which in some ways can be equally, if not more, detrimental to certain local ecologies. We really need to think about things from a much, much wider systemic perspective and really understand what the long-term implications and impacts of our proposed solutions are. At the moment, we're sort of plastering things with very quick fixes, but again, that's not really enough. So let's seize these opportunities and actually address them with genuinely regenerative and transformative solutions. That's where we can have an impact, I feel.
Thank you, Ennikukka, and thanks very much for the question. Let's take the next one. Yes.
Hear me now? Yeah. So I'm Matthew Freeman. I am president of the British Institute of Interior Design. So thank you very much for all you've said today. It's been really interesting. What I wanted to say was to do with Samantha's point about localization and sort of tying in with the scaling up idea. Do vertical farms help with any of this sort of generating of materials that you can use? Because I've been looking into it, and if you had them in schools, things like that, you can grow exactly the products that you need for the schools. And if you have them on farms, you can grow the same for the cattle. Restaurants can grow what food they need for their restaurants. But does vertical farming help with, like you're talking about your algae and the mushrooms, and does that grow that, and could that grow that at the volume that you need? Because you could put those in everybody's garden and scale it up from there.
Yeah, no, I think vertical farms are fantastic. There's a fun fact: almost all the tomatoes that come to Europe, that are eaten in Europe, come from the Netherlands. Tiny, tiny country. And when you go there, it's not all tomato farms, but they make really good use and efficient use of their space. So, yeah, absolutely. I think vertical farming, use of vertical space, is a really efficient use of space. Might not necessarily tackle the issues of diversifying when we're talking about farming, because then it's difficult to grow diverse crops, because if you're designing a vertical farm, you're probably being very particular and specific about what you are designing it around, so say tomatoes, for example. So yeah, very different issues, but yeah, I think vertical farming is definitely the future for growing mass crops and algae in particular. If you've ever seen algal bioreactors, they're just like long green tubes. Some of them are like pools, and they can go as high as you would want them to. But,
yeah, I think like the work that I was looking at was kind of localization in a different sense, in that so I was concerned specifically with phosphorus pollution in our fresh waters, and that actually is quite a localized thing depending on what country you're in, the amount of urbanization in the country. And so I was looking at blooms of algae that grow anyway, so you really don't need to help them, they're just growing at a massive rate, and the issue is what do you do with them, because they become this waste stream. So what's interesting there is like if you're trying to create products or something from the algae, it's then totally different. You're not getting it from one source, you're getting it from multiple sources at the same time, and that source might be a different quantity each time, and it might even be a different species each time. And is it possible to have a sustainable business that deals with a crop that's not in the same place, not at the same time, not the same amount, not the same species? What can you make from it potentially?
All right, thank you very much for the answers and the question. And yes, there's some couple there in the middle.
Hi. Hello.
Oh, it's over here.
We've got a question from online. So Nina is asking, how do we design cultural change in a competitive landscape with market-driven decisions?
Who would like to respond to that?
We have the question again, maybe, to remind us.
How do we design cultural change in a competitive landscape with market-driven decisions?
Make it profitable? I don't know.
I mean, I think there are different levels of the problem. I think I am very pleasantly surprised of what I'm seeing coming from the creative industries. I see so many young designers and young people from all around the world really setting amazing precedents, and I think that is actually quite strong in creating like an interesting path. We of course need governments to have good policies, and in terms of regenerative design, I think there should be really good schemes to start promoting this. So we need obviously longer visions, and policies are very important. But I think designers have a really important role in making this exciting, taking this to the communities, and I also think there's like a grassroots also way of going about it. But we should be working on it at various scales, from graphic design to journalism to designers, architects, interior designers. I think we should all keep working on this, and I think eventually it will come up to important decision makers.
I agree with policy as well. Like one area that I think is gaining a lot of traction and is really interesting is the idea of giving personhood to ecosystems, to bits of land, and to other kinds of organisms. In a way, in a sense, like subverting the legal system that's in place, because by giving personhood, we don't have to view the kind of destruction or pollution or whatever we're doing to the organism or the ecosystem by its effect on humans. It can be actually by its effect on the ecosystem itself. So, like a lot of the time they look at the amount of pollution in a river only in terms of what is a hazardous level to a human. And this is like a reimagining to what's the hazardous level to the river, right? And so just that kind of, and I think it has to be like a legal shift, but that kind of a legal shift, I think, is like very transformative and is, I think, regenerative.
Yeah, I would agree. I think particularly in terms of policy as well, kind of always goes back to that same thing of diversity, having a more broad suite of voices being represented, particularly, like you were saying before as well, indigenous voices who might have more experience with particular ecosystems. When it comes to policy and governance, making sure that it is not just a monocrop of people to look after our very diverse ecosystems. It's a diverse ecosystem of people looking after our ecosystems. So I think that's quite an interesting way to tackle the issue.
And I mean, cultural shifts and perspective shifts and legal shifts would be needed, right?
Yeah.
And I guess when a question gets formulated like that, how do you become competitive in the market system? Then there's so many assumptions within that already, right? But as the panelists have said, we need these plural values, alternative ways to value things. And I suppose what is competitive might be very different in 5 or 10 years as well, hopefully. Right?
I have something positive to say in this very depressing context. I think actually, if we do things regeneratively and we really apply ecological principles, the products that you will get will be significantly better. Like food, for example, with a really nice soil, you will get more nutrients. And the same thing with the cotton of that nice shirt that is coming from regenerative farming. It will be better. And maybe the last point that I forgot to mention, I think, is education. If the new generation and all of us are transitioning and understanding ecology is really important and we have to change, maybe yes, we are new customers that are willing to pay a little bit more, buy a little bit less of other stuff, and really invest in regenerative products.
Thank you for that. Great. I think, do we have time for another 2 or 3 questions? So I'll leave it up to you two.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. That was amazing and inspiring. I'm Nicole. I studied biodesign here at CSM. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to just ask 2. The first one is, so I thought as Samuel was talking about eutrophication and how we can use those waste streams as a resource, I was thinking about the leather industry and how leather is like a waste stream from the meat industry. And I've been learning about how much more effective it would be if we just left the skins to decompose in nature than working them with chemicals and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was thinking, is there like an ethical framework around getting waste and making it a resource? Because it can be, for example, electrification, it's a product of all the animal industries and all the crop industries, right? All the excess nutrients in the water. So if we rely on making new industries out of these wastes, if we want to erase these bad industries, aren't we making that transition more difficult? One question. And then the second question will be around, maybe for the Becoming Regenerative project. Do you have an ethical framework when you educate your clients around something that you're bringing from an indigenous culture, and how are you kind of giving back to those cultures, or is there any thoughts and ideas around that? Those are the questions.
Yes, please.
So I think, firstly, which is I think an important point for all of this, is that the context is the most important thing. Like, it's so important to learn as much of the context of the issue that you're working with, because, as you said, yes, sometimes phosphorus pollution, for example, is from the meat industry. In the UK, it largely isn't. It's from non-meat-based crops being over-fertilized, and it's also from human waste streams.
With the animal manure a lot as well, so it's still coming from the meat industry.
It's mostly from mined phosphate. Another specific issue. Okay, so an ecologist, this is also a kind of classic ecologist thought, which is we should stop fertilizing the ground or stop over fertilizing the ground, because then that fertilizer doesn't get into the waste stream. It is not I am not saying that that's not a good option. There can be a plurality of ways of dealing with the problem. I think we should be reducing the fertilizer that we use. I also think that we should be totally rethinking our way of dealing with human waste, which at the moment we have sewage outflows that are literally just going into fresh water. We need to redistribute that back to farmland or kind of clean it in a way in which nutrient pollution doesn't fall into freshwater bodies. But the specific issue with phosphorus pollution is that you have this thing called legacy phosphorus. So even if we literally stopped using any phosphorus in the UK right now, never used it, there's 50 to 100 years of it in our soils, which will keep polluting our waters. So essentially, we need to do something proactively to reduce the effects of the pollution. And many of the effects of eutrophication happen when algae blooms die, not necessarily when they're grown. So there's a potential there to remove the algal blooms before they die. And the issues there is they die and then they release large amounts of carbon dioxide and they create a hypoxic environment. And so that is the very specific situation in which I'm saying there's a business case to use this waste product. And I know that was a really long spiel, but I think every kind of regenerative project needs a really long spiel to tell you why in this specific case it makes sense. So there might be some very specific cases where soya makes sense or growing mushrooms makes sense, when in other cases they don't.
I would agree with that as well, that it's very rarely the actual project or process or material that is the issue, it's the scale and the scale of the problems that we have. So plastic, for example, small amounts would be completely fine and is very necessary in some like medical fields, for instance, but it's the scale that we're using in producing these things at. And that's why we need these projects that are small and that are specific and that are responding to a very particular issue with a very particular solution.
Thanks for the question on our projects on sort of ethical stance. As very briefly put, we're beginning the project by just studying existing startups and design projects. So we will sort of try to analyze how they are approaching environmental ethics, for instance, or ethics in regeneration. We are working on a regenerative impact strategy, and ethics will be a very important component of that. So would love to keep up the discussion on ethics. Thank you. So we have time for one or two more questions, I think, and you get to. Okay.
Hello.
So Molly will bring you the mic.
Hey everyone, I'm Marnie. I am a strategic sustainability designer. How does regenerative translate to business? Because right now it's kind of in the realm of innovation and in the realm of the more creative thinking people. How can you make a business case for that? And how long is that going to take before it can realistically translate to a language that they're going to understand? Also, the paradigms involved, like degrowth and stuff, are really weird to like the mainstream. So how does that translate, and does it translate, and does it even need to translate?
Great question. I'd love to discuss this with you directly later as well, but I want to turn to Samantha to perhaps provide a couple of answers.
Yeah, I think it is a tricky one, for sure. The first thing that came to my mind is that it is fashionable at the moment. That's one way to translate or to convince, I suppose, if that's what your angle is. It is fashionable to be sustainable, to be regenerative, to be green. And in some ways that's bad because that can lead to greenwashing. But it does bring up the question, do the means justify the ends? Does it matter if we get to a regenerative point? Does it matter if the motivation was just to be seen to be fashionable, to be seen to be green? I don't have the answer to that, but that is, I know, a technique that has been used to try and encourage maybe certain bigger companies to be more green and more regenerative and more sustainable.
Great, thank you. I mean, if I was a startup in this field, the simplest thing I would do is I would go through maybe 10 or 20 successful regenerative startups in this space who've received, I don't know, 4 to 5 million pounds in investment. Then I would go and see who are the investors and why are they believing in this? And I would potentially contact those investors so I would get the startup going. So I think there are ways into this, and my personal message would be that I don't always see why regeneration and business should be in opposition. I think the starting point should be that these are not in opposition, and there is a degree of understanding, as you've said. So I think it's up to us to maybe also strengthen those bridges. But thank you for the really, really important question. I think we have time for one more.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, my name is Hua Long. I'm year 2 biodesign PhD student from UCA. So I got 2 questions. First of all, I need to introduce my topic because it's related to my topic. My topic is about plant blindness, try to build a new multi-relation relationship between the human and natural. I try to use like plant education, community, policy, and creative application to engage my project. During my research process, I found even we want to revalue of the new system, like ecosystem or whatever wish system, we need like my first audience to interesting or recognize the problem is in here, let them interesting. Oh, you should be interested in my new system. And then when my first audience interesting or recognize, oh, the problem is here. So we can do the next step, like revalue or do some other sides. So I was curious, how did you guys to, like your first audience, recognize the problem is in here, interesting, the new system, you made it? This is the first one question. And the second question is about human-centered design and non-human-centered design. Because in the academic, during our design research thinking, we all try to use non-human non-human-centered design to support our research, to support our project. But when we do the practical base, like practical project, we will know non-human-centered design, how hard to push the ecosystem. But when you change to human-centered design, it's more easier. So I was curious, during your practice project, are you still use non-human-centered design, or you change to human-centered design? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll have 2 brief responses, and then we'll have to conclude. Who would like to make a start?
I have a quick point on the second question, which was human-centered design was like originated by Dom Norman. And funnily enough, about 3 or 5 years after he created it, he said that it wasn't actually that good. And he came up with a different thing called activity-centered design. Unfortunately, it didn't quite jump off in the same way. But the main difference being lots of different types of people often do the same activities. And that's the kind of things that we should try and design for, like how do we make the activity itself work well. And I think maybe activity-centered design can apply to non-humans as well. So that's how I try and think sometimes, especially in the algal project I recently just talked about, from not a human-centered perspective, but from an activity-centered perspective.
I think also on the same part of the point, to me, human-centered design is limiting your thinking of the project to one part of it, the human part, correct? Then a way to move away from that is to think of not systems design per se, but designing for the system, which is possibly on the same wavelength to what we were just talking about. So instead of focusing on one small part, looking at the entire system that will be involved. So your product, not just looking at the thing that you are creating or the process that you're creating or the project, but looking way, way back to where the materials are sourced from, the end-of-life solution, looking at the entire system itself, which I think is probably one of the core parts of regenerative design in general as well.
Great. I was wondering if Ennikukka would have anything to say about the need to get an audience or a group interested in your solution, and how do you accomplish that? I mean, you're certainly quite experienced with getting groups of people think quite differently.
Thank you. Absolutely. And building on what Samuel and Samantha have already said, I think this holistic approach is absolutely vital in really understanding who the key stakeholders are. And by stakeholders, again, I don't mean just the human stakeholders, really understanding what are the networks of so-called influencers or users in our cases, who are the primary, secondary users of, or the audiences that will be impacted by whatever we are creating. So I wholeheartedly agree that we absolutely must look at it from a bigger systemic perspective, but also in my case, I've created my own methodology, the Design for Empathy methodology, where actually first and foremost, I start from the perspective of empathy, understanding where the empathy gaps are and where there are opportunities for empathy, where that's absolutely needed. So in terms of thinking about how to involve audiences, how to get them interested, again, there isn't really one approach fits all. I think it's very much about the things that have been already mentioned in the panel around really understanding your context beyond the humans that are involved, understanding the wider ecosystems, understanding who are already working in the space, what they're doing, what their needs are, what their agendas are, what kind of change you're looking to create, and thinking about that change that you want to create, what are the key leverage points within that. So today we've covered everything from cultural transformation, we've talked about policy shifts, we've talked about legislation. There are so many different leverage points that we could be working towards, and thinking about it from the perspective of design. I think we need to become much more contextual and much more specific and focused. Samantha talked about this earlier, really understanding what are the sort of communities or the context where we're building those first case studies to prove the need for something like this, but also to show that shift, to prove the impact that we're trying to demonstrate. So I would really start by building out those networks and ecosystems, building a very in-depth understanding of the context, and then understanding what kind of knowledge, what kind of collaborators we need to bring upon that change to facilitate the project. I think that's, again, one of our superpowers as designers is, we like to see ourselves as sort of jacks of all trade, but really we're also very good at bringing together different people, different skill sets, different knowledge bases, creating these networks of collaborators. So I think that's a key thing to consider as well, is that what other voices do we need? We've talked a lot about diversity today in a human and non-human sense. What are the different voices that are missing? Whose voices need to be heard? And how we could build these processes of very much more equitable collaborations, again, across human and non-human collaborators.
All right, thank you so much, Enni Kukka. You've done a fine job summing up the discussion today. Thank you for that. And a big thank you to the whole panel from me and to the authors of today's film. And I think, Molly, could you put up the final slide of the event? If we have the clicker somewhere, I think it's there. If you could click forward, please. And maybe the next one, I guess, yes. Yes, thank you so much. So there's the QR code for the mailing list. Sign up to work with us, to follow us. I think Enni Kukka got thrown to the other side of the screen, perhaps. But yeah, we would love to stay in touch with you as Becoming Regenerative hopefully develops and grows further. But just today's been, enormously insightful for me as well from a personal perspective, and I hope it has been interesting to all of you today. Thank you so much for the contributions. Thank you so much for the questions. And now we still have, I think, 50 minutes for the fun bit. So time for networking, and then we must be out, I think, by 6. Is that correct, Molly? So yeah, thank you so much once again for coming, and let's enjoy the networking bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much.